All right, welcome back. It is 1:27. Let's go back on the record after our lunch break. Where we left off was the cross-examination by Mr. Becerra of Dr. Davids. And I believe Mr. Becerra has more questions for Dr. Davids. I see we have Mr. Becerra here, Dr. Davids here, and Mr. Bivens and Mr. O'Brien. So I think we can go ahead and get started. I will turn it back over to you, Mr. Becerra. You are on mute.
Yep. 2 years into this, you'd think I'd be better at it.
Me too.
Okay, there's Dr. Davids. I was going to say I didn't see him, so now I do. I have the speaker view. I know I can set it to gallery view. Is there some way to modify it on, say, board side so I can see Dr. Davids a little better?
I think they can. I think they can pin us. There's a way to do this. Look, it's happening. Maybe. Or they're working on it.
I assume this is Ms. Mullen, so I will express my thanks once again. Excellent. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, Dr. Davids.
Good afternoon, Mr. Becerra.
Ms. Mullen, could we please pull up Dr. Davids' written testimony, which is exhibit KWBA 100, and go to the bottom of PDF page 6, which is hard copy page 5. Okay. Dr. Davids, do you see that lines 23 through 25? You expressed the opinion we've discussed previously. You see that?
I do.
Okay, what I want to do is talk to you about the equations by which you produce this. So if we could please go to PDF page 33, which is hard copy page 32, I believe. Okay, and could we scroll down just a little more? There we go, thank you. So, Dr. Davids, do you see your equation 05 on line 20?
I do, yes.
Is that the equation you use to calculate your lower range estimate of diversions in that ultimate opinion?
That is correct, yes.
Okay. And that equation 05 assumes Buena Vista Lake was empty for an entire year, correct?
Yeah, in that evaporation is shown to be zero, essentially. That's the diverted water for E0 case. That is correct.
And is that why it's called E0? There's no evaporation from an empty lake?
That's correct, exactly.
And then the acronym AW in that equation 5, is that applied water?
That is correct, yep.
And that is the end result of your analysis of crop water use that is based in part on the ITRC metric data, correct?
Yeah, so if we just kind of think through the steps, there's historical cropping data, based on District Securities Commission reports, the historical narrative, and also DWR reports. That's combined together with climate data and crop coefficient data to develop estimates of crop water consumption, and then that's combined with irrigation efficiency information to develop applied water estimates.
And all of that goes into your acronym AW on line 20.
That is correct.
Okay. And your input S, does that stand for estimated seepage and spillage?
That's correct. So that's defined parenthetically there on line 15 of the page that we're looking at. So estimated upper range canal seepage and spillage S.
Is there a difference between seepage and spillage to you?
Let's see here. Strictly from a canal operations perspective, yes.
And what is that difference?
So seepage is, if you imagine a simple canal, let's say that it has a start to the canal and an end to the canal, and it delivers water at the end of the canal to one field. Seepage would be the amount of water that's lost from the start of the canal to the end of the canal. That's actually going, through the saturated materials that form the bottom of that channel, and then progressing downwards into the either unsaturated zone or towards the water table. So that's seepage. Spillage would be water that is spilled out of the end of that canal, potentially, on the surface, not necessarily, going through the bottom of of a canal surface. So that's the distinction. Hopefully that's helpful.
That is, thank you. Spillage would be water in excess of irrigators' demands from the canal that would flow out of the canal at the end. Is that accurate?
Yeah, except for it doesn't necessarily have to be at the end, but yeah, yes, spillage would be characterized as most concisely as a surface flow out of a canal, not to a field. Whereas seepage would be flow through the bottom of the canal into the either unsaturated or saturated zone below it.
In your equation 6 on line 21, the only difference with equation 5 is that you're assuming maximum evaporation off of a completely full Buena Vista Lake reservoir, correct?
That is correct.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I want to understand each of these factors better, and or start with the E0 and E max factors. Could we please go to paragraph 83 in Dr. David's testimony, which is a little higher? I believe it's on the preceding page. And in that paragraph, your estimate of the maximum theoretical evaporative losses, the maximum is 122,000 acre feet a year. Is that accurate?
That's correct.
Okay. If we could please scroll down to, I believe it's paragraph 86. We talked about this earlier. And I'm going to try to summarize here to expedite things a little, Dr. Davids. In this paragraph 86, you compare the bulletin 9 evaporation figures to your calculation as something of a confirmation. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I suppose one way to characterize that would be to say that if I'm presenting a minimum and maximum, sort of expected range, that we would expect observed values to fall between those ranges.
Okay. And then you also use in this paragraph a source called D205 1964. Do you see that?
I do, yes.
What is that source?
So, and this is something that's been addressed. I think Mr. Bivens could potentially add additional sort of legal context to this, but with a subsequent filing. But this is specifically a reference from 1964. The author was, I believe it was P. Sipes. I know the last name is Sipes. He was an engineer appraiser for the Federal Land Bank, and he performed a thorough investigation of the conditions within the Buena Vista Water Storage District in the context of trying to understand whether they were a solvent organization worthy of providing federal funds as part of the Federal Land Bank.
Okay, thank you. You also rely on a document by a Mr. Stanton for these purposes?
Yeah, so Mr. Stanton provided similar, was in a similar role at the Federal Land Bank. And again, this is something that Dr. Miltenberger could speak with more precision on, in 1941, I believe. And he was also employed by the Federal Land Bank.
And for D205, 1964, do you recall what the corrected source citation is?
Do you mean the KWBA number or the person's last name who authored the report?
The KWBA number.
Yeah, if you give me a moment, I can pull that up. I have a list of all the references here. This would be, and we're talking about the 1964 report, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, it's KWBA 021.
Okay. And you're on line 26, you identify that document as stating that in 1937, there was reservoir losses of 133,272 acre feet. You see that?
I do see that.
That's a little more than 11,000 acre feet higher than your estimate of maximum evaporation from the lake. Is that accurate?
Let's see. So yeah, it's 11,272 acre feet higher. That's correct.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to pull up KBWA 20, please, Ms. Stanton. Thank you. Dr. Davids, do you recognize this as the document prepared by Mr. Stanton?
I think I need to see a little bit more of the contents here to be sure of that. I believe it's 42 pages in its length.
And KWBA 20 is your citation for Mr. Stanton's report. Is that accurate?
Yes, that's correct.
I believe there's a page where Mr. Stanton's name appears one or two down.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to recall myself. There it is, WP Stanton.
Okay. Where did you get this document?
So this is part of a collection, and again, let me clarify my response here by saying that I'm not a historian. I enjoy and appreciate history from the perspective of an engineer, but I'm not a historian. So this is a question that I think would have been perhaps better directed towards Dr. Miltenberger, because this also is his exhibit. But my recollection and my understanding of it is that there's a collection at UC Davis. I can't recall the specific name of the collection, but it's labeled as D205. And it's a collection of these federal land bank appraisals. And there was actually 3 different documents within this one collection. And I think in terms of our KWBA numbers, they're number 20, 21, and 23.
So just Dr. Miltenberger gave you this document, correct?
Well, yeah, in the sense that I did not go to the UC Davis, archive collections and open up box D205. That's correct. That I received it from Dr. Miltenberger, likely via counsel.
Okay. So did KWBA's counsel provide this document to you?
I'm sure I'm in the same case that you are in the sense of getting too many emails every day. Perhaps everybody on the call is in the same boat on that. So I have a hard time recalling off the top of my head specifically if Dr. Miltenberger sent this to me with a copy, to council, or if the council sent it to me with a copy to Dr. Miltenberger.
Okay, thank you. So other than being an associate engineer appraiser, do you know who W.P. Stanton was?
Well, based on the context of the document, I understand that W.P. Stanton worked for the Federal Land Bank, that he was a person that they deemed to be responsible to make appraisals of important matter, namely for the loans of hundreds of thousands to potentially millions of dollars. And again, I'm beyond my scope as an engineer at this point, but I understand that the Federal Land Bank deemed him to be a trustworthy individual to perform these appraisals.
That's what you're inferring from the existence of the document, correct?
Well, I guess I'm inferring from his role with the Federal Land Bank that's supported by this document.
And your knowledge of his role with the Federal Land Bank comes from the fact that Dr. Miltenberger found this document in an archive at UC Davis. Is that accurate?
I think that would be accurate in the sense that I've never met Mr. Stanton. Unfortunately, he's probably not alive anymore. And I don't know anybody else who directly knew Mr. Stanton, so I think that's probably correct.
Okay, thank you. Do you know what kind of engineer he was?
Well, I mean, from the document itself, it appears to say, excuse me, engineer appraiser.
Do you know if he was a civil engineer?
I do not know that.
Okay. Do you know what his qualifications generally were?
Again, from the document, I know that he's an associate engineer appraiser, but if by qualifications you mean, was he a licensed civil engineer? Was he licensed by the bar? Was that sort of licensure? No, I do not know what his credentials are.
Okay, thank you. Do you know by what methods he prepared his estimates of evaporation losses from Buena Vista Lake Reservoir?
I'd like to take a moment to look more closely at the document, if I could, to answer that question.
Well, let me just ask you, as of now, do you know what methods he used?
Yeah, I'm trying to recall. There's so there were a period of 4 years that Mr. Stanton reports in Table 5.
Can we go to that page, Dr. Davids?
Yeah, so it's on page 32, PDF page 32, Table 5. So based on the footnote of this table, I understand this to be that the records were actually provided by the district themselves. and that they were subsequently averaged to form monthly averages. And then you can see that there's, periods that do not have complete evaporation record data. That would be namely 1937, but the subsequent 3 years had complete monthly observations such that they could be summed to form an annual total, and then the average of those 3 annual totals could be averaged to develop a 3-year average evaporation depth expressed in feet.
Is that your sole basis for understanding how Mr. Stanton conducted his analysis?
Again, let me classify this, or let me state that I am not a historian, again, for the record. But when looking at a summary, a quantitative summary of information, what you have as an engineer to interpret the methodology that was used is the context of the documentation, or the ability to discuss with the authors themselves, in greater detail. Of course, the second option was not a valid option. And so based on the context of this quantitative summary of evaporation for the lake, and the, I think, rather articulate statement of the footnote of related to the methodology that was used, I would say that's sufficient information to understand that it was district-derived records. Presumably the district refers here to Buena Vista Water Storage District. I think that's can be clear. That's the topic of this report. And that it was provided to Mr. Stanton, or perhaps somebody who helped prepare this report in order to develop Table 5 here. And
so you believe this is an adequate basis to use Mr. Stanton's evaporation estimates as confirmation of your analysis?
I do, and partly again, a wise person once told me that engineering is the fine art of making good assumptions with limited information. And so whenever you're presented with information, it's important to put it into the broader context that you develop from your experience over the years. And the part of what I interpret this quantitative information through is a basic understanding of evaporative processes. Now, evaporation is a complex process. Of course, we know it to be the transition of liquid water to water vapor, but it's dictated, or rather limited, by the amount of energy in the system. And as you know, when you want to boil your tea in the morning, you have to put a lot of energy into it. And so in that sense, there's a limit to the amount of evaporation that can occur based on the energy in the system. Now, in this case, we don't have an oven that's giving energy to our teapot. We have the sun that's providing energy to really power the process of evaporation. And there's a theoretical limit to how much energy can be provided by the sun. And that's in part expressed by some of the climate data that I analyzed. And so, again, this threshold of about 5.2 to 5.3 feet per year for this particular area is that sort of threshold value that I would expect for evaporation. And these numbers correlate very nicely with that.
And Mr. Stanton reached the conclusion that evaporation from Buena Vista Lake reached over 133,000 acre feet in at least 1 year. Is that accurate?
Yes, and I'd like to remind myself, give me a moment to look at so that year was 1937. And that is the year that there are incomplete data from this table. And I'm trying to recall how he backfilled the data for the missing months. But I guess from a theoretical basis, let me just try to tie together these evaporation depths to a volume. So essentially, having the depth of evaporation as listed for these 3 different full years and then as an average on the right, the way that you would compute a volume of evaporation from a depth is to multiply it by the area over which that evaporation was occurring. And so if we knew the area of the lake surface, then we could compute that Mr. Stanton used for the 1937 estimate, then we could compute the depth that he would have used to calculate that evaporation.
And that total was approximately 133,000 acre feet.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. Can we please go down to page 22 of this document, which is PDF page 24? And if we could go down a little further. Do you see paragraph 77?
I do.
Do you see how the last sentence characterizes the reservoir as having 200,000 acre feet total effective capacity?
Yeah, I'd like just to have a moment. And Ms. Mullen, would you mind just zooming in a little bit? And then I'll take a moment to read the paragraph 77. Could you repeat the question, Mr. Bizzarro?
I just was asking you to take a look at the paragraph, so thank you for doing so.
Okay, yes.
And you rely on Mr. Stanton's report as a reliable source of information concerning the operations of Buena Vista Lake Reservoir. Is that accurate?
Could you be a little bit more specific by what you mean with the operations of the Buena Vista Lake Reservoir? Because, well, yeah, maybe add some specificity to that.
You have relied on Mr. Stanton's report to help you confirm, in your opinion, your analysis of evaporation from Buena Vista Lake Reservoir. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think that's a more precise statement, and that does reflect how I've used this this exhibit here.
Thank you. Do you see in the last sentence of Mr. Stanton's paragraph 77 on this page that he refers to the reservoir as both enabling diversions to irrigation and affording carryover storage?
I do see that. That's after the dash at the end of the paragraph.
Thank you. And as we discussed before lunch, your analysis does not include any accumulation of water in the reservoir from 1 year for subsequent use in the following year, correct?
That is correct. And if I could, it might be worth just adding, well,
no, that's
let me stop there. That's correct.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Davis. So I'd like to go back to your written testimony, exhibit KWBA 100. Or actually, I take that back. A better thing here is probably his PowerPoint KWBA 148. Thank you, Ms. Mullen, you're amazingly quick. Can we please go to page 10, slide 10? Okay, so I think you explained this. This is the flow chart of how you ultimately develop your ultimate opinion. Is that your ultimate opinion? Is that the box on the right-hand side of this document in the middle that starts EST period max diverted water?
Yeah, that's correct. As I'm looking at this flow chart now, I'm seeing that it sort of represents a watershed, if you will, and all of the arrows point to that one box. So that is the culmination of this whole analysis in that sense. So that is correct.
Okay, and backing up that watershed, we back up eventually to the second column that is ES and the box 2 down, EST max crop evapotranspiration. Is that right?
That's correct. And then parenthetically is the FAO 56 approach for estimating crop water consumption.
Okay. And then at the bottom of that column, you've got 2 sources for the KC value, which is the crop coefficients. Is that accurate?
That's right. KC stands for crop coefficient.
And the 2 sources are the ITRC metric data we discussed previously, and then published values.
That's correct. Those are the lowermost boxes in the 4th row, I suppose, from the top.
Okay. Now, you relied on ITRC metric data whenever it was available, essentially. Is that accurate?
Yes, and that's correct. And just to add, some additional details, I think I've had the pleasure of working with Dr. Wim Bastiansen, who's the original developer of the surface energy balance algorithm for land. He published it first in his dissertation from Wageningen in 1998. And I've had the chance to work
I'm sorry, can you say that paragraph over? It's too fast for me.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, my first loss here on speaking too quickly. Where did you lose me there? Sorry.
I had the pleasure of working with Dr.
Okay, yeah, it's a Dutch name. Wim, it's W-I-M, and then Bastiansen, B-A-S-T-I-A-N, S-S-E-N. I think I messed that up, but it's close enough. Bastiansen. And he was the original developer of the surface energy balance algorithm for land, which is this remotely sensed approach that ITRC metric is, I guess you could say, sort of like a child of, if you will. And so I'm very familiar with the technology, and the reason why I bring all this up is to say that I've used this technology, not specifically ITRC metric, but again, the parent model of ITRC metric for crop water analyses all over the world, in Nepal, Myanmar, Afghanistan, Israel, Palestine. So it's a familiar process, and it's something as hydrologists and water resources engineers we get very excited about, because again, it's actual pixel by pixel crop water consumption that allows you to develop actual crop coefficients pixel by pixel.
And just to confirm, you have not provided that pixel by pixel electronic data as an exhibit in this hearing. Is that accurate?
The pixel by pixel data has been offered to be provided to whomever would request it, and I think Mr. Bivens could add additional details on that.
And then the specific data you used was developed at Cal Poly by the Irrigation Training and Research Center. Is that accurate?
Well, I think we've gone into this in great detail earlier. Let me see if I can.
I just want to confirm, Dr. Davids, you just described a great deal of information about metric, and I just want to understand the specific application of it that you used. It's developed at Cal Poly. Is that accurate?
Objection, misstates testimony.
Overruled. At least I don't think it does. Mr. Davids, you're very good at qualifying your answers, so I will leave that to you.
Okay. Yeah, what the clarification I want to make is, again, and I think we've used this, I think an analogy prior to lunch, but is that there's a distinction between a process and then the information that are developed by that process. And so I want to be very precise here to say that I did not turn the crank, if you will, on the ITRC metric process. Rather, I leveraged a data set that was produced by, I believe it was Dr. Howes, who actually turned the crank, who is the Buena Vista, one of the Buena Vista expert witnesses. That Dr. Howes was the one to actually turn the crank on that analysis and subsequently provide the data as a product of their contractual obligation to the Kern Groundwater Authority as ultimately the client's property per clause 6 of the contract that we looked at earlier today. And that data is
Dr. David, you answered my question. Thank you.
Okay, great.
So I'm going to try to economize time here a little bit. Can we please pull up Dr. David's testimony, which is exhibit KWBA 100, and go to PDF page 23, which is hard copy page 22. And in the interest of trying to economize time here, Dr. David, I'm going to attempt a summary. Do you see paragraph 58 of your testimony?
I do.
So beginning at paragraph 58 and continuing through paragraph 61, you describe how you developed crop demands for the entire period of 1885 through 2020. Is that accurate?
Well, I might clarify that to say, before I agree with that statement, to say that these paragraphs have the focus of understanding how to adjust the crop coefficient data that we see from best available technology, in the 2016 through 2019 period, or the published values, which again are based on current cultural practices and crop varieties. So the nature of these paragraphs is really focused on understanding how to perturb or how to adjust those current crop coefficients to reflect likely realities and differences in cultural practices and crop yields. So that's the nature of these paragraphs.
I'm going to attempt an attorney summary just for my understanding. You said in these paragraphs, you took the ITRC metric data as best available information and perturbed it back to 1885 to estimate crop water demands throughout that period. Is that accurate?
This is maybe the engineers and the lawyers need to have a mind meld here, but let me see if I can get a better. I'm not sure if that's accurate. I guess it was the output of the ITRC metric evaluation of crop coefficients, which actually it reminds me. I wanted to point out that in a sense, if I could just very quickly, in a sense, my slide. I'm just going to find it.
Dr. Davids, I need to understand what you're saying in paragraphs 58 through 61.
Yeah, you bet.
Can I just jump into, and I'll try to cut through. I'm not trying to be glib here, but maybe Mr. Davids, Dr. Davids, I have an almost 9-year-old son. If you could attempt this as if I were him and 9 years old, that would probably be about appropriate for me and the other attorneys in the room. and I realize there are a lot of caveats here, and you're attempting to keep your testimony absolutely accurate, and I appreciate that, but maybe that will help us here.
I do appreciate that. And I have, let's see, I guess they're 10,
All right.
12 and 15 years old. So I understand the importance of being able to explain the most complicated things. In fact, I don't think you really understand something until you can explain it to a 9-year-old. So I appreciate that.
So let me try to answer. Let me try to ask the question again. Paragraphs 58 through 61. You're explaining how you went from 2016 to 2019 IRTC metric data and perturbed it back through time to develop crop evapotranspiration back all the way to 1885. Is that accurate?
I'm still not sure the 9-year-old would understand that, but I think I think let's just move forward and say that's okay for now. Yep.
I know that when I was a 9-year-old and my dad was growing cotton, I was not interested in crop evapotranspiration. So
I think
right.
Perturb was the word I was.
That's right. How about just adjust or
adjust?
modify,
wonderful.
Modify.
That's a wonderful term. Thank you. All right. So in order to conduct that adjustment, I understand on your lines 20 through 21 here, and I believe you testified to it earlier, you used Kern County Agricultural Commissioner crop yield data to develop the adjustment. Is that accurate?
That is correct. Yep. And specifically with the focus on alfalfa, because of the conservative nature of the correction, if I were to use the other crops that I investigated, it would be a much more significant adjustment.
Understood.
Than alfalfa.
And so the Kern County Agricultural Commissioner data, was that from the entirety of Kern County that you used?
Yes. So the reported Kern County Agricultural Commissioner data is not spatially explicit. Sorry for the 9-year-olds. That's maybe there. It's not clear where from the county that data is from. So it's aggregated or combined to a Kern County-wide average. That is correct.
So it could include crops grown in the Antelope Valley on the east side of the Tehachapies. Is that accurate?
I'm not familiar enough with the Antelope Valley to know if either alfalfa, barley, corn, or cotton, I believe, were the 3 crops that I looked at. Rather, sorry, it's alfalfa, barley, cotton, and wheat are grown in the Antelope Valley or not. But presumably, if the Antelope Valley is within Kern County and those crops are grown there, then yes, it's possible that that's included in these values.
Do you understand the Antelope Valley to be in the Western Mojave Desert?
Is Antelope Valley past Lake Isabella as you go out? I forget the name of the highway out that way.
Well, first, do you know where the Antelope Valley is located?
This is why I'm struggling a bit. I pride myself in having a reasonable sense of California geography, but the Antelope Valley is unfortunately not one of the ones that comes right to the top of my mind.
Without testifying, I'll say that I participated in the Antelope Valley groundwater adjudication, and it is the area near Palmdale and Lancaster.
Okay, understood. Yeah, thank you. I'm aware now of that geography, and I had forgotten that it was called the Antelope Valley. Yeah.
Is that area part of the Western Mojave Desert?
The delineation of where the Mojave Desert starts and ends is also not clear, at least crisply so in my mind. But I guess we could say that the Antelope Valley is not part of what would be considered the Great Central Valley.
Is it possible that this alfalfa being grown in the Antelope Valley would require more applied water than alfalfa being grown in the Great Central Valley?
Objection assumes facts not in evidence.
Overruled. I don't think it assumed any, it was a question of whether it's possible. You can always answer, Dr. Davids, I don't know is a fine answer in those circumstances when it's appropriate. So
Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. As engineers, we always want to know, so I appreciate the, I don't know. I would have to look at the evapotranspiration, the reference evapotranspiration data and compare that to the Buena Vista area to know the answer to that question.
Okay, and earlier today, you testified in response to a question from Ms. Kinsey that effective precipitation depends on soils. Is that accurate?
Yes, so the National Engineering Handbook, method 623, I believe it is, has a dependency on soil type.
In using the Kern County Agricultural Commissioner crop yield data, did you account for different soil types within Kern County?
Well, again, I guess let me just remind us that the Kern County Agricultural Commissioner yield data, is a countywide product that does not have spatial specificity to where the data come from. However, the data are an average that's area weighted. So the predominant production areas within the county are most strongly weighted in terms of providing that overall average that we see and use.
And your opinion, your ultimate opinion is specific to use of water for irrigation within the Buena Vista service area, correct?
Yes, that is correct. And so that is correct.
Do you know whether the soils within the Buena Vista service area are different than in other parts of Kern County?
Well, I'd like to, if we could, just quickly try to sort of deconflate the effective precipitation from this discussion of the crop water consumption. I want to make sure that it's clear that the soils information that I used to solve for effective precipitation were soils data directly for the Buena Vista Water Storage District service area. So I just want to be very clear that this question, as it relates to crop yield, does not have any bearing on effective precipitation calculation. So as long as that's clear, I can move on to the second part of your question.
Okay, let me understand. You are testifying ultimately about irrigation deliveries within Buena Vista Water Storage District service area. Is that accurate?
That is correct.
And your part of that analysis is how much water the crops within that service area required. Is that accurate?
That is correct.
Would effective precipitation be something that affects how much water those crops need? Or let me rephrase that. Is effective participation a factor that would affect how much irrigation deliveries those crops would need?
Yes, thank you for sharpening that statement. And I do agree with that. And the effective precipitation that was computed was, spatially tied to the soils information directly within the Buena Vista Water Storage District.
Okay. But the agricultural crop yield information you used was spread across the whole county. Is that accurate?
Yes, unfortunately, with many historical reports of yield, they're not spatially explicit. Thankfully we have GIS nowadays that ties information to location, and it's a very robust way of understanding information to always retain that spatial component. But unfortunately, these agricultural commissioner data are countywide yield averages. And it's the most, it's the best available data that goes as far back as we possibly can, that anybody
Okay,
performing a similar analysis would rely on.
Your opinion is that the Kern County Agricultural Commissioner crop yield data is the best available data for purposes of your analysis. Is that accurate?
That's correct, and I wouldn't have used it if I didn't think that. Yeah.
Okay. And as part of that, you reviewed the crop yields of alfalfa, barley, cotton, and wheat. Is that right?
That's right. Those were the 4 crops that I looked more specifically at.
Okay, and you ultimately chose alfalfa as the crop on which to base your adjustment of crop yields back into time. Is that accurate?
That's correct. And if we want, we could pull up slide number.
Thank you, Dr. Davis. I am trying to economize time a little. Thank you.
Okay.
Can we please bring up Dr. David's technical memorandum, which is exhibit KWBA 104. And then please go to his page 13. Thank you, Ms. Mullins. I believe there's a statement. Yes. Do you see at the top of the second paragraph, which begins the period after the district? Do you see that sentence?
I do. Yeah, the second paragraph there.
Yes. And that sentence identifies a period of 1968 through 2000. Is that accurate?
That's correct.
And it states that during that period, cotton was the dominant crop. You see that?
Let's see here. Let me read the whole paragraph here, or at least a few sentences.
Certainly.
Yes, so I see at the end of the first sentence, it says from 1968 through 2000, saw cotton continue to be the predominant crop.
But what does it mean to you what does the term dominant mean here to you?
It means that in relation to all the other crops, it was the largest crop in terms of cultivated area.
Dr. Miltenberger referred yesterday at one point to cotton being king in Buena Vista. Is that essentially what the dominant crop means here?
I think that's a fair assessment, and I think again, it really depends on what time period we're talking about, because cotton was not king for all of time, but was king for, looking at my crop history graph, and I can look up the tabular form, but I would say it's probably from about 1936 through 2010, perhaps, maybe through 2014. It was the king crop, if you will, or the dominant crop.
Okay, thank you very much. And all of that period is within your period of adjustment of crop yields for purposes of your analysis, correct?
That's partially correct in that if we look closely at my written testimony, the adjustment for alfalfa yield reduction only started in 1990. So to the extent that cotton was king after 1990, there was no adjustments post 1990 to the crop coefficients. But prior to 1990, there was a linear reduction in crop coefficients that were applied to all crop types. Again, more conservatively than if we were to use a cotton specific crop reduction based on the yield data we see. It would have been even a more significant reduction in crop water consumption if we were to use a cotton-based reduction.
Can we please pull up Dr. David's PowerPoint exhibit KWBA 148 and go to slide 16, please. So Dr. David's, this slide depicts the information you had from the Kern County Agricultural Commissioner to use as the basis for your adjustment of the 2017 through 2019 data back to 1885. Is that accurate? This depicts that yield data?
It does. And if we drill deeper into this discussion.
Dr. Davids, thank you. I
Okay.
appreciate it. Do you see the graphic for cotton?
I do. It's the lower right graph.
And it depicts that you had no cotton crop yield data available to you from the Kern County Agricultural Commissioner from 1960 through 1985. Is that accurate?
Yes. Unfortunately, the Agricultural Commissioner Office data for that period was unavailable.
And that data is during the period between, I think you said, the 1930s and the early 2000s, when cotton was the dominant crop in Buena Vista Water Service District. Is that accurate?
Well, I don't think it covers the entirety of that period, but I think it does overlap with the period of cotton's dominance. I think that's correct.
And you ultimately chose alfalfa as the crop whose crop yields you used to conduct the adjustment from current satellite-based data to 1885 crop demands. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think that's accurate. And again, I think it was the conservative move to take. As you can see, the slope of the yield reduction for cotton is precipitous compared to alfalfa. So it would have been a more significant adjustment that
But you had no crop yield data from Kern County for cotton for 25 years. That's what that graphic depicts. Is that accurate?
Yes, I think those missing bars reflect the lack of data for those respective years.
Okay, thank you. Can we please pull up Dr. David's exhibit KWBA 133?
This was the exhibit I think I was hoping that we could look at. So.
Thank you very much, Ms. Mullen. So, Dr. Davids, this graphic depicts your adjustment this depicts how you calculated the linear interpolation of alfalfa crop yields that you applied to adjust 2017 through 2019 data back to 1885. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think there's a lot happening on this graphic that we could go through. So I think it's hard to say that this characterizes the information that went into the decision of how to make this adjustment. And I think there's more to be said there, but yes, I think that's correct.
So you computed an average alfalfa yield among the data from 1985, 1990, and 1995. Is that accurate?
Yeah, so the orange triangle represents the average that you speak of. That's a 10-year moving window average. Well, it's not a moving window, but it's a 10-year average about 1990. So it's inclusive of 1985 and 1995. there's 3 samples that make up that average, and then the average of those 3 make up the one triangular yield, which is at approximately 7.8 tons per acre.
And the crop yield data you used was from the Kern County Agricultural Commissioner, correct?
Yeah, that's right. So as labeled in the legend at the lower left, the blue dots represent the reported alfalfa yield data from the Agricultural Commissioner's Office in Kern County. And again, the 3 blue dots in 1885, 1990, and 1995 were averaged to form that one triangular measurement.
Just to, Dr. Davis, I think you misspoke there. You referred to some of that data as including 1885. Did you mean 1985?
I did, sorry. Yes, my head was a century behind. My apologies.
Not a problem, thank you. And that was the Kern County Agricultural Commissioner data from the entire county. Is that accurate?
That's right, just because the data lacks the spatial definition to know anything other than this for the entire county. That's correct.
And then you also calculated, as represented by the green dot, an average crop yield value from among the alfalfa yield data from 1955, 1960, and 1965. Is that accurate?
That is correct.
And then you linearly interpolated between those 2 averages to develop your adjustment curve that reaches back to 1885, correct?
That is correct.
And that curve is represented by the red dashed line on exhibit KWBA 133.
That is correct.
So your alfalfa crop yield data for 1914 would be on that dashed red line. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I suppose if what you're asking is if we were trying to make a yield prediction, an average yield prediction for alfalfa, based on these Agricultural Commissioner Office data, that we would follow the red dashed line back to where it intersects 1914 and then proceed across horizontally to the vertical axis, and that would be the anticipated yield. So yes, that's correct.
Thank you. You had no crop yield data from the Kern County Agricultural Commissioner before 1955, as depicted in this exhibit, correct?
Yes, that is correct. The Agricultural Commissioner data ends in 1955 for alfalfa specifically.
And your analysis extends back 70 years from 1955 to 1885, correct?
That is correct. It is 70 years, yes.
And 1914 was 41 years before 1955. Is that accurate?
That is also correct. Yep.
Now, I see 2 data points from before 1955, and they're both in 1920. Is that right?
That's correct. And I think I covered these during my initial presentation. These are 2 references in the historical materials from Barnes in 1920. I think you spoke with Dr. Miltenberger at length about the Barnes report, which provided some of the foundational materials for Bulletin 9 published the next year. And the reference was and I think I quoted in my legend there, the lower value was a good yield of alfalfa being 5 tons per acre, and the red X represents a possible yield of 6 tons per acre. And then the page numbers are referenced there.
Thank you, Dr. David. You saved me about 5 questions to identify the Barnes report. So thank you for that. The red X of possible yield of 6 tons per acre, that is from page 47 of the Barnes report. Is that accurate?
That is correct.
Is the 5 tons per acre yield from the Barnes report from page 21 of that report?
Yeah, that's what's stated on this figure here.
Okay. I'd like to pull up exhibit KWBA 13. Please, Ms. Mullen. And Dr. Davis, I'm going to ask you just for the record, do you recognize this as Mr. Barnes' 1920 report? And I recognize you may need to scroll through it a little to identify that.
Yeah, let's just take a quick look here. Yeah, I think, let me go, I have a copy of it open on this site too. Let me just take a quick look at the, yeah, I think this is what I take to be the Barnes report, KWBA 013.
Thank you. Can we, Ms. Mullen, can we please go to PDF page 26, which I believe is page 21 of the report? Thank you. Dr. Davids, can you point out on this page what material is your basis for using 5 tons per acre as an alfalfa yield as of 1920?
I always find this manuscript a bit difficult to read because of the whatever the other stuff is that's on it. There's no line numbers, but I would guess it's maybe line 12 or 13. There's a paragraph. Well, it's kind of the, I don't even know.
Can you identify the first word in the line?
Yeah, so it would be the 3 irrigations as outlined above.
That's the first words of the sentence you're identifying?
That's right. It's again, it's probably about 10 to 12 lines down.
And so are you relying on the portion of that sentence that states a good yield under these circumstances is said to be 5 tons to the acre?
That's correct.
Do you know what Mr. Barnes's source for that statement is?
I think this, again, I want to clarify that I'm not a historian. And I also want to clarify that I relied, on discussions with Dr. Miltenberger to ensure that this has, the historical veracity of a number that should be used in a quantitative analysis. And it was his opinion that it was, and so again, as an engineer, I don't think that's my role necessarily to make that judgment, but as a professional historian, I think Dr. Miltenberger did, and so that's the hopefully that answers your question.
Do you know whether there's any actual crop yield data reported in Mr. Barnes's report to support this statement about 5 tons to the acre?
Well, I suppose I would consider this report directly, just because it's not written in a table. I consider this to be quantitative. This is a quantitative statement by the author of this document, who I don't believe had any, reason to be misleading anybody. I think there was some factual basis, behind what he's stating here. And again, not as a historian, as someone who needs to trust the professional work of Dr. Miltenberger and the fact that this is a quantitatively sound assessment of alfalfa yield within within the reported area that they're analyzing.
Do you know what data Mr. Barnes used to produce this quantitative statement?
Do you mean like what types of scales and how they counted the bales and that sort of thing that were summarized to produce this data? Is that what you're asking?
I'm just trying to understand why you're referring to this as a quantitative statement.
Well, it's quantitative in the sense that it states a number, 5 tons per acre. So that's, and that just, if it was in a table and it said the number 5, it wouldn't change I think the veracity of the value. Is just written out in full form as a sentence here.
But you don't know how Mr. Barnes reached the conclusion about a good yield under these circumstances is said to be 5 tons per acre.
It would be nice to be able to go back in time and discuss things of this nature with these authors, but no, unfortunately, I do not know exactly what went into his assessment of 5 tons. I don't know.
Do you see higher in the paragraph, it refers to this 5 tons per acre having been generated by alfalfa fields that were pastured?
I do see that.
Do you know what that means, pastured, in this context?
Well, from my understanding of cattle operations, you can either cut and bale and use forage crops for feed, or you can actually directly graze the cattle on the field itself, and that pasture is typically in reference to a direct grazing method for providing feed to a cattle operation.
Okay, thank you very much. Can we go down to the next paragraph? Do you see that it refers to where the alfalfa is not pastured?
I do. I see that. Yep.
And then at the bottom, Mr. Barnes refers to an quote average yield of 6 tons to the acre being produced by alfalfa that was not pastured.
I do see that. Yes.
Do you know how Mr. Barnes calculated that average of 6 tons to the acre?
I think the answer is the same as my answer to the previous question about the 5 tons per acre.
That you accept that as accurate, but you don't know what the source of data was. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Do you know what percentage of alfalfa fields within Buena Vista were pastured versus not pastured as of 1920?
I do not.
Okay, thank you. Can we please go to page 47 of Mr. Barnes' report, which I believe is PDF page 55?
And Mr. Becerra, just to keep in mind, we're probably about due for a break. So at a good point, please let me know.
Absolutely. So, Dr. Davids, you identified this page as your source for the 6 tons per acre for alfalfa yield in 1920 on your exhibit 133, correct?
That is correct.
Can you point out the text on this page on which you relied for that number?
I'd like to take a moment to read through this. If you wouldn't mind, or if you wouldn't mind, Ms. Mullen, could you scroll down a little bit so I could see the remainder of that second paragraph, please? Thank you. That's perfect. Okay, so if you wouldn't mind, Ms. Mullen, just scrolling back up so we could see the entirety of that first or second paragraph there. So there's a restatement of the good yield under these circumstances to be 5 tons per acre. And then it says when alfalfa is not pastured, and it goes on to say produces an average yield of 6 tons.
Do you know what data Mr. Barnes used to calculate that average of 6 tons for unpastured alfalfa?
I think the answer is the same as the previous question there. No, I do not know what data goes into that.
Okay. Can we please go back to Dr. David's exhibit KWBA 133? And Dr. David, your linear interpolation line for alfalfa yield depends on having the 1920 yield be at 6 tons per acre. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I'm not sure I would characterize it like that. You might say that if you follow the red dashed line back in time, where it crosses 1920, which is when the Barnes report was produced, it crosses at 5.9 tons per acre. So that's essentially the predicted value of this linear regression. And again, that's towards the top end of this range that we're seeing in the literature at the time of between 5 and 6 tons per acre.
Okay.
So
you calculated that red dashed line based only on data preceding 1955, correct?
That's correct. And then the red X and the green star are not used in the development of that regression, but they're plotted to show agreement between, but rather not only agreement, but also the fact that we're on the upper range of the agreement. I think it would have been also valid to use the blue dashed line, which is actually just a straight linear interpolation off of the 1990 and previous data, but that has a steeper yield reduction. And I think I thought the more conservative approach was to use the red dashed line.
Your only 2 data points during the 70-year period from 1885 through 1955 are those 2 data points in 1920 from the Barnes report, correct?
Objection, misstates testimony.
I think that I'll sustain that objection. Mr. Becerra, will you rephrase your question?
Sure. Dr. Davids, you have no data points to support your regression line from before 1955, correct?
Well, this is a complex question, and the answer has to do with the difference between building a regression and then testing a regression. And so when you build a regression, you always want to reserve some data in order to test whether that regression is valid or not. If you use all of the data to build your regression, you have nothing that's independent to that to verify whether the regression is valid or not. So just to be very specific here, the blue data points were used to build a regression. The red X and the green cross were used to validate the veracity of that regression, and the fact that it kind of splits the difference and is on the conservatively high side, I think gives me confidence that we're doing so.
And so the only data points before 1955 you have to test your regression are those 2 from Barnes 1920. Is that accurate?
That is true. Yes.
And you don't know what the sources of data were that Mr. Barnes used in stating those alfalfa crop yields. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a good question for Dr. Miltenberger to understand. I mean, my assumption would be that there was a quantitative method of counting bales, for example. Typically, bales have a certain weight. And so the way that they would do this is they would count the number of bales that were developed over a certain number of acres. And, you know, if the bales, for example, were 100 pounds and they had 50 bales, why then that was 5 tons per acre. So I think, again, I think the point is that we can trust these data. I mean, the counting of yields was how the farmers were compensated for their yield. So of course, it's like if we go to the gas station, you know, we trust that it's actually 5 gallons we're getting because we have to pay for those 5 gallons. So in the same way, you know, the farmers their livelihoods dependent on an accurate method for quantifying their yields. So I think this is a trustworthy data set.
Ms. Kinsey, I'm going to move to strike that response as non-responsive. Dr. Davids just stated a number of assumptions and speculation about how the yields were calculated. We just referred to the citations he provided in the Barnes report that did not state any of that.
I think that's fair. I'll strike that testimony as non-responsive to your question.
Thank you. And this is a good time to take a break. Thank you.
All right, let's do that. It is 2:49. Let's return at exactly 3 o'clock. I will see you shortly. All right, let's go ahead and get started again. It looks like we have Dr. Davids, Mr. Becerra, and Mr. Bivens. So I hand it back over to you, Mr. Becerra.
Thank you very much. Ms. Mullen, could we please pull back up Dr. David's exhibit KWBA 133? Dr. Davids, you show no data points here from the 1930s or 40s. Is that accurate?
That is correct.
If you had had data from those periods, could it have affected your interpolation of changes in alfalfa crop yields over the period 1885 to 2020?
I think this goes in line with the response that Dr. Miltenberger had yesterday, that I think as scientists and historians, we have to use the data that we have, and if different data are available, then of course we want to consider how that fits together with what we have.
If your linear interpolation of those crop yields were different, it would affect your ultimate opinion about theoretical maximum diversions from the Kern River for irrigation. Is that accurate?
The exact nature of how it would impact the resulting evapotranspiration of applied water estimates, for example, it is a little bit hard to explain in a very simple way. But yes, in general, I mean, if the yields would move up, why then the reduction would be again, there's a linear relationship between yield and crop water consumption. So if yields go up, then crop water consumption goes up. If yields go down, then crop water consumption goes down, all else being equal.
Okay, thank you very much. So could we pull up Dr. David's PowerPoint exhibit KWBA 148? Thank you. And please go to slide 10. So Dr. David, you recognize this as, I think you called it your watershed of the development of opinion, with the outlet being the middle box in the right-hand column. Is that accurate?
That is correct. Hopefully that was the right term to refer this to. I suppose the analysis flow chart maybe is a less colorful way of explaining it.
We're all water wonks here. I enjoyed the watershed metaphor.
Okay, fair enough.
Do you see in the middle column the box labeled estimated historical KC adjustments based on yield data?
I do, yes.
That is the portion of your analysis where differences in crop yields would affect your ultimate opinion. Is that accurate?
That's correct.
Okay. Can we please pull up exhibit KWBA 20, Ms. Mullen? And Dr. Davids, do you recognize this as the 1941 Stanton report we've previously discussed?
Yes, KWBA 20 is the 1941 Stanton report. That's correct.
Thank you. Can we please go to PDF page 28 of this report, which is table 1? Do you see table 1, Dr. Davids?
I do see table 1, yes.
Do you see towards the left-hand side of the table, it has a column labeled alfalfa and then has numbers for the period, well, for the period 1940 back to 1932?
I do. I see the first column represents years, and then the second column represents acres. Then it appears to have yield expressed as tons in the third column. That's correct.
Do you understand that column yield tons to be referring to tons per acre of alfalfa?
Well, it doesn't specify the denominator of the unit, but the values seem to be in a plausible range of tons per acre.
And do you see that those values range from 7.9 tons per acre in 1939 down to 5.6 tons per acre in 1932?
I do see that, yes.
And I believe there's 8 values in that yields ton column. Do you see that? There's 8.
Let's see. Yes, it looks like 1940 is missing and the rest of the years are there. So yes, there's 8 values.
And of those 8 values, 6 of them are at least 7 tons per acre. Is that accurate?
Yes, from a review of the data, that is correct.
And 2 of them, 1939 and 1938, are 7.9 tons per acre. Is that accurate?
Would you mind zooming in a little bit, Ms. Mullen, on the leftmost columns here, just so I can be sure to see the decimal points? It's a little bit blurry on my side. Could you repeat your question, Mr. Becerra?
The yields in 1939 and 1938 are 7.9 tons per acre. Is that accurate?
That does, again, it's hard to make out the top value. Honestly, I can't tell if it's a 7.0 or a 7.8 or 7.9. The bottom of that number is blurred to the point where I can't interpret it.
Okay, I appreciate that. They're both at least 7 tons per acre. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's correct. There is, I think it's relatively clear that the first number is a 7.
And you did not use any of these alfalfa crop yields in preparing your adjustment of alfalfa yields for the period 1885 through 2020, correct?
That is correct. I did not use these numbers.
Okay, can we please go back to Dr. David's exhibit KWBA 133?
But what page was that on before we go? That was on page 28?
Yes.
Okay.
PDF page 28.
Great, thank you.
Dr. Davids, if we took those alfalfa yield numbers from Mr. Stanton's 1941 report, 6 of the 8 at least would be approximately equivalent to the yield for alfalfa from 1955 to the present, as depicted on your exhibit 133, correct?
Could you repeat the question? I want to make sure I have a clear understanding of it.
Sure. 6 of the 8 values from the 1930s in Mr. Stanton's report were at or above 7 tons per acre, correct?
That is, let's see here. Okay, that is correct. And I want to clarify something, if I could, in that each of the blue points represented by the California Ag Commissioner's Office for Kern County represents an average of 5 years. So that's why you can see that they're spread out over 5 years. So I think I want to be careful here, for the record, that each one of these points that we're talking about essentially carries the weight of 1/5 of one of those blue dots because it represents 1 year. But that's true. There are 6 out of the 8, which would represent 1.2 worth of a blue dot. That is approximately around 7 tons per acre. That's correct.
And you used a single year of data for 1920 to test your regression in exhibit 133. Is that accurate?
Well, those were the earliest references to alfalfa yield that in correspondence with Dr. Miltenberger, we could identify. And of course, we wanted to go back as far as we possibly could because, as you are, I think, suggesting, this is a lengthy period of time to try to understand. Of course, doing history and quantitative work on history is challenging, as I'm sure you appreciate.
Yes.
So we were looking for data as far back in time as possible.
Understood. Using the crop yield data from Mr. Stanton's 1941 report, if we included that on your exhibit, those numbers would be roughly in the range of the crop yields reported by the Kern County Agricultural Commissioner from 1955 and later. Is that accurate?
I think I would need some time to do some quantitative work with these values prior to answering that question.
Well, it's relatively simple. 6 of the 8 values in Mr. Stanton's report were at 7 tons per acre and higher. 7 tons per acre and higher is roughly the spread of your data points from the Kern County Ag Commissioner from 1955 and later, correct?
That's correct, but there were 2 measurements that were 6 and 5.6, which are quite a bit lower than the record. So I think we're cherry picking a little bit here, and that's why I'm cautioning against sort of an on-the-fly assessment of where we place these data in their broader context.
But 6 of the 8 data points from Mr. Stanton from the 1930s were between 7 tons per acre and 8 tons per acre. Is that accurate?
Objection asked and answered.
I'm going to sustain the objection. I think I understand the point, Mr. Becerra, and we're now seem to be having an argument over means and modes and other things that I'm not sure engineers are very specific about, but lawyers may be very less good at. Let's either move on or ask your question in a different way to elicit new information. Please.
Thank you. Dr. Davids, would you have used those 8 data points from Mr. Stanton's report to develop your regression or to test your regression?
Objection compound.
Sustained, it is compound. Mr. Becerra, it seems easy enough to fix that.
Dr. Davids, would you have used those data points in the 1930s from Mr. Stanton's report to develop your regression as depicted on exhibit 133?
It's difficult to make an assessment on the fly again with data that that I'm just interpreting here for the first time here. So I think again, as I described earlier, there's typically some procedure where you hold back some data. And I think the methodology, in terms of deciding what data to hold back, would have to be something that required additional thought.
If you had held back that data from Mr. Stanton's report for 1930s crop yields from development of the regression, would you have used it to test the regression?
Well, I mean, certainly with again the introduction of of data, there needs to be a either a use in the regression or a testing of the regression.
And would that data from Mr. Stanton's 1941 report have been useful for one of those purposes to you?
Yeah, I think once there was a methodology developed to properly weight the data so that they were of equal worth to the Ag Commissioner reports, which again I suggest off the top of my head is dividing, these like 5 samples divided by 5, because each of the others represents 5 samples. That would be the procedure. And I apologize. In the thought of that, I've actually lost track of what the question was. So would you mind repeating that, Mr. Becerra? Sorry.
Not a problem. Actually, it is a problem.
Because I think you forget too. Yeah, I was wondering if I was hoping you would remember.
Let the record reflect that everyone is getting tired.
Let's see here.
So the data for 1930s crop yield data from Mr. Stanton's report for alfalfa, would you have used that to test your regression as depicted on Exhibit 133?
Yeah, I think the right way of saying that would be is that I would either use it to test or develop the regression. One of the two. If not, randomly selecting half of it for developing and half for testing. That's another methodology.
And you elsewhere relied on Mr. Stanton's report, Exhibit KWBA 20, in your analysis, correct?
That is correct.
Do you know whether Mr. Stanton's report specifically concerned Buena Vista?
My understanding of Mr. Stanton's report, again, is that he was working for the Federal Land Bank, and that I think there were certain financial matters that related specifically to Buena Vista, and I think his report was, I have no reason to think that it wasn't focused on Buena Vista.
And the agricultural commissioner data you used to develop your regression was from the entirety of Kern County. Is that accurate?
I think based on our previous conversations, yes, that is accurate.
Thank you. So move on to the next topic here. Can we please, Ms. Mullen, pull up Dr. David's written testimony, Exhibit KWBA 100, and go to PDF page 34, which would be hard copy page 33. And paragraph 90. Do you see that, Dr. Davids?
I do.
Do you see where you testify on lines 10 through 14? You relied on interviews and site visits with Mr. Torres to develop your seepage and loss factor. I'm sorry, seepage and spillage factor.
I do see that, yes.
Is Mr. Torres currently an employee of the Kern Water Bank Authority?
That is my understanding, yes.
Was he previously an employee of Buena Vista Water Storage District?
Yes, my understanding is that Mr. Torres worked for 25 and a half years for Buena Vista Water Storage District. I believe it was up through maybe roughly 2014, if I recall correctly. I probably shouldn't speculate, but it's somewhere around there. And again, he had 25 years of kind of hands-on operational experience with the second point distribution system. I believe at least for part of that role, his title was the second point water master.
Did you ask him under what circumstances he departed Buena Vista?
I didn't think that was an appropriate question given the technical nature of my interviews and site visits with Mr. Torres. That didn't seem pertinent to the matter at hand.
You didn't consider the circumstances under which he left Buena Vista and began working for Kern Water Bank Authority to be relevant to his credibility? Is that correct?
Well, what I considered to be relevant to his credibility was his character, his hands-on experience with the operating the system, his extensive knowledge of flow measurement and the operation of canals. I think his sort of well-respected nature. I've actually spoken with his son. And also I've heard, from many different people that he's well respected in the community. And so I did spend a day with him and ascertain all those things to be accurate from my experience. And those are the types of, as an engineer, those are the types of things that are important when assessing the reliability of information coming from an individual, is their trustworthiness and their hands-on experience with the matter that you're interested in.
You did not consider it to be relevant to assessing his credibility, the circumstances under which he departed the district about whom he was providing you information?
I think the statement that I would like to make here is that I understand Mr. Torres to be a trustworthy individual, and that I have no sense of malice or any other. I have no idea what the circumstances were of his departure. I did not ask, nor did I think it was appropriate for me to ask. And that it was more an assessment of he showed me by completely by memory all of the important sites that I had asked to see and to understand, to develop my sense of geographic awareness of how water moves through Second Point. And I had a deep sense of admiration for Mr. Torres in the sense of how much information he retained in his mind and how much experience he had. And I've always found it to be, over my 15 years plus of experience doing this type of work. And by this type of work, I want to be precise to what I mean is flow measurement, water accounting, water resources engineering in general. That I've found operators of systems to be really treasure troves of information. And Mr. Torres, again, had 25 and a half years of experience running Second Point. And that's what I took into account when evaluating the reliability of his values.
You have provided no documentation of the information Mr. Torres provided you as exhibits in this hearing, have you? You just described a huge amount of data that, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Hang on. Objection, misstates testimony, and I do think we're getting argumentative here.
I'll rephrase. Dr. Davids, you just discussed a great deal of information about Mr. Torres that you indicated made him credible to you. Is that accurate?
Excuse me, this is Kyle Wooldridge with the AHO. We're gonna need to pause for a second. Looks like Miss Kinsey's internet is going out.
Thank you.
And that would have been before the objection.
And I think Mr. Becerra resolved them by rephrasing, at least thus far. Mr. Wooldridge, do we want to take a defined break, or would you like us all to?
Let's go ahead and take a 5, so 3:32. We'll come back.
Thank you.
So hearing officer Kinsey just notified us that she is logging back in as we speak, so it might be just another minute or two.
Well, I'm back. I understand we I apologize for our unscheduled 5-minute break. I'm back in action. We can make an attempt to try to revisit exactly where I was. I had an internet connection problem, so I was suddenly removed from the hearing unexpectedly. I don't anticipate this will happen again, but if it does, I can relocate myself and we'll plan to keep going. But for now, where I recall leaving off was Mr. Becerra, you were, and I see now we don't have Mr. Davids. I don't have Mr. Davids on my screen.
No, and I was just informed that I think when Mr. Wooldridge indicated you would be another minute that Mr. Davids stepped out. So he'll be back momentarily.
That's fine. That's fine. We'll wait a moment. Certainly it was not an organized break. So we'll wait a moment and then we'll, once we're all on camera, we'll get back to work.
Ms. Kinsey, are you ready?
I am ready. Thank you. I was writing some notes. So I think where we left off, Mr. Becerra, is that, and let's formally go back on the record, but you were following a line of questioning, which had been going on for a few minutes about asking Dr. Davids as to whether he considered Mr. Torres's departure from Buena Vista to be irrelevant with respect to the credibility of the information provided to Dr. Davids. Is that enough for you to pick up, Mr. Becerra?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Dr. Davids, you described a variety of factors that caused you to find Mr. Torres to be credible, including your conversation with his son and his reputation in the community. Is that accurate?
Yes, I think that is accurate. I'm trying to think if there's other, well, yeah, that is what I said, so yes.
Have you provided any exhibits by which you have documented the factors that caused you to find Mr. Torres to be a credible witness concerning water use factors going back to 1885?
Objection, misstates testimony.
It's a long question, Mr. Becerra. Can you maybe break it down a little bit, please?
You rely on, Dr. Davids, you rely on Mr. Torres for opinions about seepage from facilities going all the way back to 1885. Is that accurate?
Yeah, during the discussions that I had with Mr. Torres, based on his 25 and a half years of experience operating the Second Point system, he provided invaluable information as it relates to the nature of seepage from channels that had been operated as far back as 1885 to convey water from Second Point to the Button Willow and Maples Ranch service areas. Now, from a geologic timescale, the difference from 1885 to 2019 is a flash in the pan, if you will. Meaning that from a geologic timescale, the differences of the Kern River channel from 1885 to present are geologically negligible. So in the greater sense of geologic time. So in that sense, the 25 and a half years of experience, again, that were passed down from his predecessor, actually, that had 40 years of experience operating the system. I forget the gentleman's name at the time, but the gentleman that he learned how to run the system from had 40 years of experience. So a collective experience of 65 years of operating this system. These were the types of information that a credible assessment of seepage can be based on.
So did Mr. Torres convey to you opinions expressed to him by his predecessor who stopped working at Buena Vista 25 years before Mr. Torres started? Is that accurate?
What I meant with that statement was that there is a oral history of how Second Point works, how the canals can be operated and how they behave. You know, the extent, of course, any trade that we learn from the people that go before us. And I certainly cannot, let me put it this way. I think the numbers that Mr. Torres provided me were based on measurements and observations that he himself had experienced over his 25 and a half years of experience. I guess the nature of how those were informed by the person who mentored him and had a previous 40 years of experience are beyond the scope of my understanding, if that's the nature of your question.
And the opinions Mr. Torres expressed to you based on his 25 years, you have provided no documentation of those opinions in your testimony or exhibits, have you?
Objection asked and answered.
I would overrule the objection because I'd like to be clear on this. Please answer.
I would say there's extensive documentation of the results of my interviews and site visit with Mr. Torres in both in KWBA 145, which we together looked at as slide 27 in the presentation this morning.
Let's pull that slide up if we could, Ms. Mullins, please. Can we pull up KWBA 148 and slide 27? Is this the slide you're referencing, Dr. Davids?
That is correct.
And this is a copy of exhibit KWBA 145. Is that accurate?
That's correct. It's a version of KWBA 145 embedded within a PowerPoint presentation labeled KWBA 148.
And could we please, Ms. Mullen, could we please go to the next slide in this exhibit in the PowerPoint? And Dr. Davids, this is a copy of exhibit KWBA 146. Is that accurate?
That is correct.
Are these two exhibits the only documentation you have provided of Mr. Torres's opinions about the operation of Buena Vista's facilities?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I would phrase it as the operation of their facilities, but they were his, again, 25 and a half years of experience running Second Point. They were his very detailed and I think quantitatively rigorous assessments of seepage for these various conveyance facilities.
These two exhibits, 145 and 146, are the only documentation you have provided for Mr. Torres's opinions and bases for those opinions, correct?
Well, I'd like to also point out that there are methodological details also provided in the written testimony that we looked at on starting in paragraph 90.
Okay. Let's pull up Dr. David's testimony in KWBA 100, please, Ms. Mullins. And Dr. David's, do you see paragraph 90 of your testimony?
I do.
In this paragraph, do you state any bases for your estimates of canal seepage and spillage other than the information Mr. Torres provided you?
I find this question like asking, is Abraham Lincoln your only source of information about the Civil War or something like that? It's like, yes, a very knowledgeable person about the topic that we're talking about is the source of the information. So yes, I think that's true.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Mullen, can we please go back to exhibit KWBA 148? Yes, thank you. And could we please go to the preceding slide? Thank you. Dr. Davids, what time period exactly, strike that. Dr. Davids, about what time period did Mr. Torres provide you information about the operations of facilities and conveyances that are reflected in 145?
I'd like to ask for a restatement or rephrasing of that question, just so I can be clear what you're asking.
Did Mr. Torres only provide you information from the 25 years where he worked for Buena Vista?
I find this to be I think an impossible question to ask. I think the information that we each contain within our minds is an aggregation of multiple sources, developed over multiple years and combined and synthesized. I find it hard to limit the scope of Mr. Torres' knowledge to exactly 25 years, if that's what you're asking.
Did he express opinions to you about seepage from these facilities from before the period he was employed by Buena Vista?
The nature, just to hopefully clarify this, the nature of our conversations was, okay, Mr. Torres, you've delivered water from Second Point through the Kern River channel down towards the intertile, let's say, just as an example. So that one reach of channel, right? So it's identified as number one, is the first row of data here. Kern River channel is what it's called. So the conversation would go, Mr. Torres, if you put 50 CFS into the Kern River channel at Second Point and waited, let's say, a day, maybe two, sort of let things steady out, but not so long where, there's a steady state condition obtained, but how much water would make it down to the intertide, the end of this channel? Then he would think and very carefully consider, again, the extent to which I am not aware of in terms of exactly what was factoring into his assessments, but I understand to be a deep sense of personal experience with these channels and say, well, if I put in 50 CFS at the top, I would say that about 30 CFS would come out. Actually, in this case, I'll be specific. He would say about 20 CFS would come towards the bottom of that channel, meaning that a 30 CFS seepage rate was observed from his hands-on experience over a period of 25 and a half years. And that's where that 30 CFS comes from.
Is that how is that how your
Well,
conversations
hang
with?
on. Excuse me, I'm just going to object. I don't think it's appropriate for Mr. Becerra to cut off Dr. Davids while he's continuing to clarify his answer.
Dr. Davids, please clarify your answer.
Yeah, I think the point that I was trying to make was that the value in column 5, it's identified column 5, and it says estimated initial seepage. Are these values, again, that are based on Mr. Torres' 25 years of experience running the system. Now, an alternative methodology for developing these seepage estimates would be to look up a saturated hydraulic conductivity value in a table. And I have extensive experience with the errors associated with using published soil hydraulic conductivity data, and they can be orders of magnitude off. For example, there is a model based on published data for Big Chico Creek that estimates a seepage of 3 CFS. But over the period of the last 3 years, I've worked with several students on a research project, and we've identified the seepage to be 30 CFS using empirical data, actual measurements of inflows and outflows, the type of knowledge that Mr. Torres has hands-on experience with over 25 years. And it's those experiences that lead me to believe, and I think would lead any well-grounded water resources engineer to trust the operators and their sense of how these channels behave well above what a textbook or what a table would tell you that the value should be.
So did you have that sort of conversation with Mr. Torres about every single conveyance listed in KWBA 145?
I did, yes.
Have you documented in any way in your exhibits the contents of your conversations with Mr. Torres as you have just described them about these conveyances?
The exhibit that is before us is the documentation of such conversations.
And that's all. That's what we have, is this document, correct?
I have site visits from my from our visit, and these are these numbers. Just mind you this. These numbers in column 5 are the direct output, right, of this conversation. There's no significant math that's happening here. It's an inflow minus outflow computation. And if Mr. Torres, if I said, hey, Mr. Torres, we put in 50 and how much do we get out on the backside after it, after the water reaches there? Okay, 20, okay, we would get about 20 CFS. Why, then that means it's 30 CFS loss. What is that? How does that sound? Okay, 30 CFS, make the table. So I mean, essentially it's like in these conversations, I'm filling out this table that we see before us. I mean, these are the raw data that comes out from the conversation.
Mr. Torres's opinions were the sole source of information on which you relied to produce the data in this exhibit KWBA 145. Is that accurate?
Well, of course, there's a sense of things, Mr. Becerra, I'm sure you can appreciate over time, again, developing a sense of what is a plausible amount given the geology of the system that you're working in. So of course I'm filtering, I call it the laugh test. If Mr. Torres would have said, this channel is about 300 CFS loss, then I probably would have started laughing because I knew that it's not plausible. That's outside the range of my understanding of what's plausible. And so of course there's a filtering process as an expert in this field that I'm passing through all the information that Mr. Torres is providing. But I think it's very plain to see in the caption of this exhibit that it says these estimates are based on interviews with Mr. Nick Torres.
And you applied Mr. Torres's opinions all the way back to 1885. Is that accurate?
And I'm going to object to the word opinions as misstating testimony. I think Dr. Davids has repeatedly testified he's talking about factual observations made by Mr. Torres based on his 25 years of experience operating the second point system.
I have to strongly disagree, Ms. Kinsey. We have no data here. We have what Mr. Torres told Dr. Davids. That's it.
Can you, since we have a court reporter, can I ask the court reporter to repeat the question back to me so I can get the precise language here? I don't mean to belabor this, but it would be helpful. If it's not too much trouble. I know this is an out of the blue call.
Okay.
Thank you.
And you had compiled Mr. Torres's opinions all the way back to 1885. Is that accurate?
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Of course.
I actually couldn't hear that. Did it say, and I had compiled or I had applied his opinions? Was the question if I had applied?
The question was applied.
Okay.
Thank you for that clarification. I put down compiled, so I didn't. But it was what we're discussing here is whether these are accurately characterized as Mr. Torres's opinions. Is there another, Mr. Becerra, is there a word we can use that's neither?
I can try to navigate through
Yeah,
this.
please.
Yeah, and I'd like to maybe.
Wait, Dr. Davids, there's no question pending.
Yeah.
Dr. Davids, did you apply the information you obtained from Mr. Torres all the way back to 1885 in your analysis?
I think I've stated this several times so far, but taking the Kern River channel, just to repeat myself, taking the Kern River channel as an example, from a geologic perspective and having a geology degree myself, the changes in a channel over the course of 135 years compared relative to geologic time are inconsequential. And so and I think I state this clearly in my testimony as well, that my assumption here is that the way these natural channels behave now is substantially similar to the way that they would have behaved 135 years ago.
Dr. Davids, I'm just going to interrupt Mr. Becerra where I'm anticipating he's going. Is your answer can you provide a yes or no answer to Mr. Becerra? I don't think you provided the context for your answer, but I don't think you actually gave us a yes or a no.
Okay. Yeah, I think the answer is yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let's look at the line in period 4 for the Alejandro Canal. Do you see that on exhibit 145?
I do. It's the second from the bottom row. Is that correct?
Yes.
I do see
And
that.
moving to the right in your notes, it states that that canal was lined in the 1960s. You see that?
I do.
And then moving above to period 3 with Alejandro Canal in your column 3, it states Alejandro Canal pre-lining. Do you see that?
I do. Yes.
Mr. Torres was not working at Buena Vista Water Storage District before the Alejandro Canal was lined, was he?
No, he was not.
Did you rely on information from Mr. Torres to state your seepage numbers for the Alejandro Canal before it was lined?
So the Alejandro Canal, well, let me try to explain this a little bit in greater detail. As you point out, the Alejandro Canal was lined for the entire period that Mr. Torres served as the Second Point Water Master. And so for this canal, which has an estimated annual seepage volume of 2,800 acre feet, pre-lining as identified in the 9th column for the row starting with Alejandro Canal pre-lining. I had to make a professional judgment based on similarities in geologic material, channel size, conveyance amounts, as to what this pre-lining Alejandro Canal seepage would have been. And this particular item was not based on something that Mr. Torres directly, obviously he has no direct experience with this particular canal pre-lining.
You developed all of those estimates yourself. Is that accurate?
Yes, I've seen the Alejandro Canal. I've traveled much of its length and understand the geology of the area and understand that it, the types of geology that it crosses, the basic flow rates that it conveys, and the size of the channel, and made an assessment of the seepage based on that information.
So your opinion as to the seepage from the Alejandro Canal before it was pre-lined is not based on any data provided in your testimony or exhibits, correct?
Objection, misstates testimony. And argumentative for that matter.
Fair, I'll sustain the objection.
Okay, thank you very much. Can we please go to the next slide, which is KWBA 146? You see column 14, Dr. Davids?
I do.
And every number in that column is 35,000 acre feet. Is that accurate?
That's correct. And just for the record, the column title is Estimated Button Willow Service Area Seepage and Spillage, acre feet.
That is a constant annual value throughout your analysis. Is that accurate?
That is the correct way to interpret the number is the same as you progress downwards through the rows. Yes.
That is a constant from 1885 to the present. Is that accurate?
I would say it's a conservatively constant value, especially during the earlier period when the amount of conveyance facilities were probably significantly less, but it's conservatively high estimate, yes.
Did you obtain that constant annual value from Mr. Torres?
That is correct.
did he state that constant annual value based on his 25 years of experience?
I have no reason to believe that this value is based on any other information than his experience over those 25 years, like the other values.
And his 25 years working for Buena Vista was approximately 1989 through 2014. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think the 2014 was something that I stated off the top of my mind. But if you have other information that substantiates that, I think I can agree with that.
Okay, thank you. Are you aware that Buena Vista has used its distribution system canals to recharge water into the groundwater within the service area?
Well, I think unlined canals, Mr. Becerra, I think are always acting as a type of recharge facility. I think if you would turn back the clock, maybe prior to Sigma or perhaps prior to that, we might call it seepage. Of course, seepage and recharge are the same thing, though, from a physical sense.
Are you aware that Buena Vista has put water in its unlined canals specifically for the purpose of recharge in wet years?
I'm going to object on grounds of relevance. I'm not sure how Buena Vista's intent with respect to unlined canals really has anything to do with Dr. David's analysis, which is an estimated upper range, an estimate of upper range demands for irrigation.
I'm going to jump in and overrule the objection. I do see, I don't know where exactly you're going, Mr. Becerra, but I can imagine a pathway here where this information is relevant. So I'm going to allow the question to go forward.
And I can explain, Ms. Kinsey,
Sure.
if you like.
Please, why don't you explain for the record?
Seepage from canals as a function of delivery to end users is a different matter than using canals specifically as a recharge facility. And I'm seeking to explore the extent to which Dr. David's considered that distinction. So Dr. David's, in accepting this constant value of 35,000 acre feet of seepage, did you account for intentional recharge through the canals?
So just to ask a clarifying question here, Mr. Becerra, are you suggesting that these canals are expressly operated for the purpose of not delivering water, but just to fill them up to let them seep? And did I account for that? Is that what you're asking?
Correct.
Well, let me try to answer it this way. The 35,000, my understanding is that that's again a value that Mr. Torres believes is the accurate representation, during his time of operating the second point distribution system, which again, I think spans from roughly the late 80s through the mid 2010s, of the nature of seepage from canals. Now, to the extent that that period overlaps with this intentional operational decision-making process that you're hinting at, that would be included in the 35,000 to the extent that this operational mode was implemented subsequent to Mr. Torres' tenure with the Buena Vista ending in 2014, then it would not be reflected in this 35,000 acre foot value.
Did you ask Mr. Torres whether this constant annual value of 35,000 acre feet was based solely on deliveries to farmers?
I think the the nature of the questions that I discussed with Mr. Torres were quite similar to what I discussed for, say, the Kern River channel. So, for example, of all the water that's put into the Button Willow service area, after you account for all the deliveries to farms, how much water comes out at the bottom? What's the balance essentially? So if you put 100,000 acre feet in and you deliver 65,000 acre feet out, and there's zero water at the tail end, why that means that 35,000 acre feet must have gone into the ground in the form of seepage. Is that,
So
I hope that's clear.
I apologize, I talked over you. This constant annual number of 35,000 acre feet going back to 1885 is simply a back calculation from how much water left the system at the end. Is that accurate?
Well, I think the methodology is similar to what I've been trying to explain the whole time. It's essentially an inflow outflow balance, right? Accounting for, it's a mass balance.
You are repeating the information that Mr. Torres told you in this column 14. Is that accurate?
Yes, I'm trying to summarize the information that I obtained during these interviews with Mr. Torres. And there, again, these are my professional opinions as to seepage based on these conversations and the site visit.
And that 35,000 acre feet constant is constant in as to wet and dry years. Is that accurate?
Well, I mean, the fact that it's 35,000 for the entire period, yes, I mean, means that it's a value that's held constant on each year. So yes, I think the answer is yes.
Okay, thank you very much. So let's go to your testimony in Ms. Mullen, if we could pull up exhibit KWBA 100 and go to PDF page 34. And Dr. David's paragraph 90. On line 25, Dr. David's, your estimate of canal seepage and spillage for that period, 1929 to 1964, is 52,800 acre feet, correct?
That is what line 25 says. Yes, correct.
Okay, and then moving down to paragraph 91 on line 28, you have a reference to reservoir losses D205 1964. Have you corrected that reference to exhibit KWBA 20?
This particular reference, I believe, and give me a second to look at the next page.
Sure.
Yeah, so this would be KWBA 020. That's correct.
And is that the 1964 SIPES report?
So the 1964 SIPES is KWBA 021. So I believe KWBA 020 is the 1941 Stanton report.
Oh, I apologize. You're right. My apologies. And if we could, Ms. Mullen, if we could scroll down to the next page, there's numbers there we need to discuss. So Dr. David's on lines 1 through 4, you cite the 1937 value by Mr. Stanton as being in good agreement with your estimate of 52,000 acre feet per year of seepage and spillage. Is that accurate?
Yes, Mr. Stanton presents 4 values of seepage. And the 1937 value is 50,346 acre feet. And yeah, my line 3 says that value is within 5%, representing good agreement.
And your seepage and spillage number is for both conveyance facilities into Buena Vista's service area and distribution facilities inside of Buena Vista's service area. Is that accurate?
Can you just clarify what you mean by conveyance facilities?
Sure. Those would be facilities to move water from the river or Buena Vista Lake Reservoir to the Buena Vista service area. That's what I mean by conveyance facilities. Does that make sense to you?
Yes, I wanted to clarify that. I just wanted more specificity, so thank you for that. Yes, that is correct. So it includes the conveyance facilities in order to route the water from Second Point to the Maples Ranch and Button Willow service areas, in addition to seepage losses of the distribution facilities within those respective service areas. That's correct.
Thank you. So can we please pull up KWBA 20 and go to PDF page 30? Oh, amazing. Ms. Mullins, you're amazing. Dr. Davids, do you see that this is table 3?
I do see that.
And do you see the line about halfway down the page, river below Second Point?
I do see that line, yes.
And for 1937 on that line, there's a number 50,346 acre feet. Do you see that?
And Ms. Mullen, if we can zoom in a little bit, that would be super, please. Thank you, even that helps.
Could you repeat your question, Mr. Becerra?
Sure. On the line, river below Second Point for 1937, the value is 50,346 acre feet. Do you see that?
I do. At the current Zoom, I'm having trouble making out some of the digits, but I see 50,000 something, maybe 300. And yeah.
Is that the number you used as a check for good agreement on your estimate of seepage and spillage in your analysis?
That is the same number that's in the written testimony, yes.
Okay. Do you see just above that line, there's the note 2 in parentheses?
I do.
Can we, Ms. Mullen, can we please scroll down to the bottom of the table so we can see note 2? Do you see, Dr. Davids, that note 2 reads, does not include losses in district distribution system?
I do see note 2, yes.
So Mr. Stanton's number for 1937 river below Second Point losses does not include losses within the district's internal distribution system. Is that how you understand this?
No, I think I have a different understanding of that, actually. So the parenthetical 2 refers, in my understanding, to the unit and the statement of the unit to the left of the parenthetical. And there is a seepage and evaporation loss, which represents that row, and then there's river below Second Point. But I think that note does not refer to the river below Second Point.
Do you see any information on this table 3 that indicates Mr. Stanton quantified distribution losses within Buena Vista in any way?
There's a lot on this table here. Let's see. Mr. Becerra, would you mind repeating a question, please?
Sure. Do you see any information in this table 3 where Mr. Stanton quantified distribution losses from Buena Vista's? I'm sorry, it's getting late in the day. Let me start over. Do you see any information in this table 3 where Mr. Stanton quantified seepage losses from the district's distribution system?
I think the river below Second Point would be inclusive of the district's distribution system, would it not, or is it?
Is that what you understand footnote 2 to say?
I mean, footnote 2 says does not include losses in district distribution system. And river below Second Point.
Dr. Davis, I don't mean to interrupt, but let me try this a different way.
Sure.
Do you see the line there, seepage and evaporation losses? And then there's the line that has the note 2.
Mm-hmm.
And it states for 1937, 183,400 and I believe that's a 6 acre feet. Do you see that?
I do.
I'm sorry, no, it's an 8. I apologize. So do you see on that line 183,418 acre feet?
I do.
So moving back to the left, the line river below Second Point and reservoir losses, if you add those two, do they add up to 183,418 acre feet?
I believe they don't actually, but maybe that's a 6 instead of a 4. But yeah, I mean it's roughly the same number.
So that total of seepage and evaporation losses of what appears to be 183,418 acre feet does not include any seepage from the district's internal distribution system. Is that accurate?
I think that the footnote is suggesting that, yes.
And you use that number of 50,346 acre feet in 1937 to compare with your estimate of the combination of conveyance and distribution losses, correct?
That is correct.
Okay, thank you. I'll move on to my next subject. I hoping to finish this by 5, Ms. Kinsey. I know we have a hard stop.
Mhm.
Dr. Davids, can we please, or Ms. Mullen, can we please go back to Dr. David's testimony, Exhibit 100? And can we please scroll down to his paragraph 97, please, on PDF page 36. Dr. Davids, these paragraphs 97 through 100, they concern evaporation off of Buena Vista storage in cells 1 and 2 generally. Is that accurate?
That's correct.
Did you use the FAO 56 method for calculating that evaporation?
That's correct, with an open water coefficient of 1.05.
And what does an open water coefficient of 1.05 mean?
So FAO 56, I think we've seen it parenthetically on the watershed schematic that we've referred to, is an equation that relates evapotranspiration to the product of reference evapotranspiration times a crop coefficient. And it was originally developed to characterize crop water consumption, again by Allen et al. In 1998. However, there's been extensive research on using a similar approach to estimate evaporation, especially from shallow reservoir surfaces that don't have large thermal capacities. And in that case, there's a reference that's Allen. I'm blanking on the primary author's name right now. It's ASCE 70. It's from 2016. The primary author's name will come to my mind here, but they suggest a crop coefficient of 1.05 to characterize evaporation from a shallow open water surface such as Buena Vista Lake.
And for these purposes, how deep is shallow?
I would have to look up the ASCE 70 reference. I'd say it's on the order of, well, yeah, I don't know off the top of my head. That's the right way to say that.
Okay. For purposes of today, would 3 feet be shallow?
I think, 10, 15 feet would be shallow.
Okay, thank you. So let's go to your testimony, PDF page 36. And again, paragraphs 97 through 100, you perform technical calculation to estimate evaporation from cells 1 and 2. Is that accurate?
Yes, that's correct.
And Ms. Mullen, if we could scroll down, please. Thank you. Further to the next page so we can see the bottom of paragraph 99. And you state on lines 5 and 6, in other words, if Buena Vista cells 1 and 2 were filled and the water was stored for an entire year, 86% of it would evaporate and not be available after 1 year. Do you see that sentence?
Yes, that's the last sentence of this paragraph at the top of the page.
And are you aware that in 2017, Buena Vista stored water in cells 1 and 2 for about 3 months?
I'm not personally aware of the fact, no.
Have you performed any analysis as to the amount of water stored in cells 1 and 2 that would percolate into the ground?
There are a handful, I think, of helpful references in the historical materials that discuss the nature of seepage losses from the Buena Vista Lake bed. But other than reviewing those historical references, I have not performed seepage tests, nor specifically looked at operational records that would help to quantify seepage losses from specifically Buena Vista cells 1 and 2.
Are you aware that when cells 1 and 2 are dry, they are farmed?
I am aware of that. I have been on to the lake bed myself.
To the extent water would percolate from cells 1 and 2 into the ground, would it potentially be available for the farmers who farm there more regularly?
I mean, mass is neither, I mean, there's a conservation of mass principle here, I think is what I understand the simple nature of your question. If water goes into the ground, then it doesn't disappear. So I think the nature of what we're discussing in this paragraph is evaporation. So I don't see the pertinence with what we're talking about. But yes, if water goes into the ground, it doesn't disappear, if that's what you're asking.
And it would not evaporate either, correct? From the open water. Let me rephrase. If the water in cells 1 and 2 percolated into the ground, it would not evaporate from the open water surface. Is that accurate?
I mean, the process of evaporation requires an interface between the atmosphere and the water molecules. So, I mean, it can also evaporate from wet soil. So I suppose the answer is a bit more nuanced, I think, than what you're suggesting. I mean, water, even that infiltrates, can still evaporate. It just has to be wicked up by the soil and exposed to the atmospheric demand for moisture, and it can still evaporate.
Okay, thank you. Has the Kern Water Bank Authority ever asked you to perform a technical analysis of evaporation off of its recharge ponds, similar to what you've described here in paragraphs 97 to 100 of your testimony?
I'm sorry, can you ask that question again? It's getting late in the day. So.
Sure, I can ask the question again. Has the Kern Water Bank Authority ever asked you to perform a technical analysis of evaporation from its recharge ponds, similar to what is reflected in paragraphs 97 through 100 of your testimony?
No.
Can we please bring up exhibit Buena Vista 804?
And I'm going to object to the introduction of this exhibit and questions about it on grounds of relevance. I do not understand how the Kern Water Bank Authority, the Kern Groundwater Authority, its groundwater sustainability plan, the Kern Water Bank storage project are relevant to the hearing issues that have been identified in the January 2022 hearing notice.
And I note the objection, Mr. Bivens. I'm going to overrule it based on my discussion, similar discussion in the written ruling issued earlier this morning. So I will allow introduction of this exhibit for purposes of cross-examination at this time.
Dr. Davids, do you see that this is the first page of the Kern? Well, if we could scroll down, please. Do you see, Dr. Davids, that this document was prepared by Jonathan Parker?
I do see that, yes.
Do you understand Mr. Parker to be the general manager of the Kern Water Bank Authority?
I do understand that, yes.
Have you been to the Kern Water Bank?
I have during the site visit that I performed in March. I was also able, well, part of the distribution facilities, in fact, Second Point itself lies, squarely within the bounds of the current Kern Water Bank Authority, and for that purpose, I have traveled through and adjacent to several of the spreading basins within the Kern Water Bank Authority.
Does the picture we're currently seeing from the cover of Buena Vista Exhibit 804 depict accurately the amount of vegetation in the Kern Water Bank Authority's recharge ponds?
Objection, vague as to time.
A fair objection. Try again, Mr. Becerra.
Sure. As of the time you toured the Kern Water Bank Authority's facility, does the picture on their groundwater sustainability plan accurately depict how much vegetation was in their recharge ponds?
This is a complex question. If I recall correctly, there were mesquite that were growing. There were some perennial grasses growing. Let's see, I think there were some species of willow trees, perhaps. I can't tell from this distance, from this photograph, if those species are mesquite or willow. I also can't tell exactly what the more deeper green color represents. So I find it impossible to answer this question, frankly.
Okay. I assume when you toured the water bank, it's earlier this year, its recharge ponds were relatively empty. Is that accurate?
I think that's accurate. We're all acutely aware of the third year of this particularly painful drought that we're collectively experiencing.
Does the picture on the cover of the Water Bank Authority's GSP accurately depict how much water could be stored in those ponds based on your observation?
Objection.
Let me rephrase. Dr. Davids, based on your observations, could the Kern Water Bank Authority's recharge ponds contain as much open water as this picture on their groundwater sustainability plan indicates?
And I'm going to, again, object on lack of foundation and undue consumption of time. Dr. Davids has testified that he hasn't performed an analysis of these issues with respect to Kern Water Bank Authority. And frankly, given the significant amount of time we spent on his cross-examination, I think this is a pretty questionable value to the hearing officer.
Well, let me ask Mr. Becerra, where are we going with this? I would like to know.
As Buena Vista's testimony describes, Buena Vista's observation is that the pumping of the Kern Water Bank Authority has caused drawdowns within Buena Vista's service area. I'm attempting to understand the technical bases that supports that pumping. I can just cut to the technical question if you'd prefer, Ms. Kinsey.
Well, I'm not sure. You could try the technical question.
All right, let's just do that.
Okay.
Ms. Mullen, can we please go to page 7 of this document? Oh, I think I may need PDF 7. I apologize. Oh, shoot. Yes, I'm sorry. Yeah, I think we need to go 5 pages forward. My apologies. I'm looking for a paragraph that begins the MOU. I have it down as page 7. I can check.
There's one here that says the MOU at the top.
Ah, thank you, Ms. Kinsey.
Yep.
Yes, that's it. Dr. Davids, do you see that paragraph that begins the MOU?
I do. It's the second paragraph on the page that we're looking at right now.
And the second sentence states surface delivery losses are 6% of all water delivered to the KWBA for storage. Do you see that?
I do see that, yes.
Would a loss factor of 6% from surface water deliveries into groundwater storage be technically defensible, in your opinion, for the operations of the Kern Water Bank?
Objection, relevance and lack of foundation.
I do wonder the relevance, Mr. Becerra. We're not attacking, I mean, at least
The relevance
maybe we
is
are, but what is the relevance?
relevance is that if the water bank authorities' assumptions about losses from delivered water into groundwater storage are wrong, then their pumping may be overdrawing the aquifer and drawing water out of Buena Vista.
Hold on, let me track that. Can you say that for me again, please?
Sure. And Buena Vista believes, as stated in its testimony, the water bank's recovery cycle pumping is drawing water, groundwater, out from under Buena Vista. If the water bank's technical assumptions about the losses from their surface water deliveries are wrong, that supports Buena Vista's concern about the effect of the bank on groundwater.
That seems to me, Mr. Becerra, I will say that seems to me one step too far in the sense that I think when it's Buena Vista's turn to put on evidence, you're going to put on evidence, as I understand it, about declining groundwater levels and such. I'm not sure that the reason or the misconception of data by Kern Water Bank Authority, it just was one step beyond. So if there are other questions more closely related to the alleged decline in groundwater tables, that seems, that's what I'm allowing in here. So
I'll just have a couple more questions.
Okay.
Dr. Davids, do you see the loss factors in that paragraph that begins MOU, the MOU?
I do, yes.
Has the Kern Water Bank Authority ever asked you to conduct a technical analysis as to whether those loss factors are defensible?
No, I've not been asked to perform that analysis.
Thank you, Ms. Kinsey. That concludes my cross-examination.
Thank you, Mr. Becerra, and thank you, Dr. Davids, very much for your time and energy answering these questions. It's 4:41. What I would propose to do is to break for the day. We would reconvene tomorrow morning and begin with any additional cross-examination of Dr. Davids, and then proceed to questions that I or other staff at the AHO may have. And then we would allow for redirect and go forward from there. Are there any comments about either that process or any other procedural matters before we break for the end of the day? Mr. O'Brien, I see your mute is off.
I do have one item I'd like to bring up. Mr. Becerra asked a series of questions of Dr. Davids relating to Mr. Torres and the circumstances of his leaving Buena Vista. A lot of people are watching this hearing in Kern County and elsewhere. And I think it's grossly unfair to Mr. Torres to have that sort of innuendo brought into this hearing process. Mr. Torres will be here next week, as we discussed this morning. But I'm going to make an oral motion. I'd be happy to back it up with a written motion to exclude any further discussion about Mr. Torres and the circumstances of his leaving Buena Vista until he's here in person and can defend his reputation.
Thank you, Mr. O'Brien. I'm not going to rule on that oral motion. I need to think about how we are going to proceed forward with Dr. David's testimony. And it sounds like the offer of Mr. Torres's participation, but I accept the oral motion. It's noted on the record, and I understand that. I will look to you, Mr. Becerra. Do you have any response to either, I don't know, but I'm looking for a response to Mr. O'Brien's motion, but you may respond. And then also the suggestion that Mr. Torres will be available for questions next week, whether you had time to think. I know you've been on the spot all day long, so you can also defer a response until tomorrow.
I would like to do that.
Yep.
In relation to my questions about his departure, I don't believe I actually asked for any information about it. I asked Dr. Davids if he had asked and whether he considered that information to be relevant to Mr. Torres's credibility. I don't believe that I actually asked why he left. I understand the sensitivity of employment decisions, whatever they may be. Mr. Torres is being presented as a source of information about his former employer. I wanted to understand if Dr. Davids had asked about that.
It's pure innuendo.
Thank you, Mr. Becerra. Thank you, Mr. O'Brien. I understand I was there for the questions, and I received the motion. So let's leave that. For now, we can return to it tomorrow morning. Mr. Jacobs, you're now not on mute. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. I'm just trying to get some information for my witnesses
Yes.
on timing. So who do we have going tomorrow? How many more witnesses for the water bank and then for BV?
Well, I will turn to Mr. Bivens, I think, on you're probably the best person to speak to that.
So we do have two more witnesses. I would have thought they would have been done by today, but at this point, I really have no idea how long it's going to take to get through their cross-examination. I do know.
Well, Mr. Bivens, let's pause for a moment. Okay, we all sat through everything today. I really appreciate Dr. David's participation. He is not a short-spoken person. Okay, so let's caveat that.
That's fair. And
right. So, but understood that it's quite difficult to estimate cross-examination. But I think just knowing you have two more witnesses, I believe. I didn't total up. I have the numbers, but I didn't total them up. But well less than an hour for their direct presentation, as I understand it. Does that fit your understanding, Mr. Bivens?
Yeah, Mr. O'Brien and I put our heads together and figured between Dr. Davids and Dr. Miltenberger and accounting for some of the interludes for Mr. Becerra, we were at roughly 80 minutes. And I think we'll be well within that tomorrow on direct.
Thank you, Mr. Bivens. And then Mr. Becerra, do you have, are you able to speak to, just off the top of your head, the number of witnesses from Buena Vista?
We have 6 witnesses from
6.
Buena Vista.
Okay, thank you. Which is 2 hours, regardless of the number, but roughly. So, Mr. Jacobs, that may be I don't know if you want more details. That may be the best we can do because we're estimating the time for cross, which is quite difficult. But does that help?
Yeah, I think we're looking probably at Thursday for my witnesses then.
I would not tomorrow.
Yeah.
Thank
Thank you.
I'll give that commitment. Are there any other procedural matters or issues we should address now?
I have one, and it's very brief. Our office uploaded the deposition transcripts and associated exhibits for Mr. Moody and Mr. McCarthy earlier this morning, and it occurred to us that perhaps the hearing officer would like those formally marked as exhibits. If that's the case, we'll do that and re-upload them if that's the way you'd like to proceed.
Yes, please. Let's do that. Thank you. Anything else? Well, I wanted to thank all of you. Dr. Davids, thank you for your time today. I know it was a long day and you're not quite done yet. Thank you to all of the attorneys. We moved through this. I know it was long, but it was very dense testimony, and we are moving forward. And I appreciate all your work. I know this is, as has been pointed out by, I think, most of the parties, this is an accelerated schedule to some extent, and we're all working hard here. So I will see you in the morning. Thank you. Have a good evening. And we are adjourned for the day.